Occupied France, late 1943. The German High Command, in its strategic assessments of the Atlantic Wall, consistently underestimated the logistical demands of a sustained Allied invasion in Normandy, a miscalculation that would ultimately unravel their defensive capabilities. This oversight, rooted in a flawed perception of the region's infrastructure and the nature of modern warfare, left them vulnerable to an enemy whose true strength lay not just in combat power, but in an unprecedented capacity for movement and supply. The stakes were nothing less than the Western Front itself, and with it, the course of the war. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief in the West, received regular intelligence summaries detailing the state of French infrastructure. His staff, drawing on pre-war surveys and current reconnaissance, consistently reported a road network deemed adequate for localized defensive maneuvers and the limited movement of reserves. The underlying assumption was that any invasion would be met and contained relatively close to the beaches, obviating the need for extensive long-distance supply lines for the defenders. A detailed analysis of German logistical planning documents from this period reveals a focus on railway capacity for strategic redeployments, with roads primarily relegated to tactical distribution within divisional sectors. The road density in Normandy, while seemingly robust on a map, comprised a labyrinth of narrow, often unpaved, secondary routes and ancient departmental roads, many designed for horse-drawn traffic or light agricultural vehicles. These were deemed sufficient for the anticipated movement of infantry and light armored units to counter a beachhead. Quantitative projections, based on standard Wehrmacht doctrine, estimated daily tonnage requirements for a defending corps at approximately 600 to 800 tons, with a significant portion allocated to ammunition and fuel. These figures, derived from static defensive scenarios on the Eastern Front, failed to account for the dynamic, attrition-heavy nature of an amphibious assault followed by a breakout. The sheer volume of materiel required to sustain continuous combat against a well-supplied foe was simply not factored into their road network assessments. The strategic implication of this misjudgment was profound. German forces would be forced to fight a modern, mobile war with logistics predicated on an outdated, static defense. Their initial confidence in the road network's security, a security based on the absence of immediate threat rather than inherent capacity, would prove a fatal illusion. The roads they believed were secure. The initial chaos of D-Day obscured the long-term logistical challenge. Beachheads, once secured, became conduits for an astonishing volume of materiel. The German High Command, operating on intelligence often weeks out of date, initially believed that the Allied invasion, once contained, would necessarily falter due to the inherent difficulties of sustaining a large force across a hostile coast. They underestimated the industrial capacity and logistical ingenuity that had been meticulously developed over years of preparation. Field reports from June 6, filtered through the shattered communications network, painted a picture of localized, though fierce, engagements. The initial assessments from LXXIV Army Corps headquarters in St. Lo focused on the immediate tactical threats: the paratroopers behind the lines, the amphibious assaults on the beaches. They noted the intensity of the naval bombardment and the aerial superiority, but the sheer scale of the Allied supply chain remained largely unquantified, an abstract threat rather than a concrete reality. The first days saw the establishment of rudimentary beach maintenance areas. At Omaha, despite heavy casualties, engineers began clearing obstacles and laying down perforated steel planking. Utah Beach, less contested, saw a more rapid buildup. By June 10th, unit diaries from the American 5 Corps recorded the successful landing of 14,000 vehicles and 140,000 personnel. These numbers, while significant, represented only the tip of the logistical iceberg, a continuous flow that would swell exponentially. The German defensive strategy, predicated on a swift counterattack to push the invaders back into the sea, failed to materialize. Panzer divisions, held back by Hitler's indecision and then delayed by relentless Allied air interdiction, arrived piecemeal and exhausted. Their fuel consumption, a critical vulnerability, was exacerbated by the circuitous routes forced upon them by constant air attacks on bridges and roads. Fuel reports from Panzer Lehr Division, moving towards Caen, showed a 30% increase in consumption, due to detours and idling under air cover, a drain on already scarce resources. The Allied solution to the logistical bottleneck was multifaceted, evolving rapidly from the initial beach landings. Mulberry harbors, though damaged by the Great Storm of June 19th, provided a crucial initial surge capacity, particularly at Arromanches. Simultaneously, the Duck-U amphibious trucks, initially conceived for island hopping in the Pacific, proved invaluable in shuttling supplies directly from ships to inland depots, bypassing congested beach exits. Production logs for the Duck-U showed an output of 2,000 units per month by early 1944, a testament to American industrial might. The German intelligence apparatus, already struggling with the sheer volume of information, was further hampered by a fundamental misinterpretation of Allied intentions. They expected a traditional European campaign with supply lines extending from established ports. The concept of a sustained, high-volume logistical operation directly from open beaches without the immediate capture of a major port was largely dismissed as impractical. Interrogation files of captured German officers consistently revealed surprise at the speed and efficiency of the Allied buildup. One officer remarked, "We expected a trickle, not a river." The Allied strategy was not merely about moving goods, it was about moving them continuously and in overwhelming quantities. The Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system, would soon become the arteries of this logistical beast. Its genesis lay in the immediate post-D-Day period, as the need for rapid, high-volume transport from the beachheads to the advancing front lines became paramount. The planning for such a system, involving thousands of trucks and personnel, had been underway for months, a testament to foresight that the Germans simply did not possess. The German generals, still confident in their ability to contain the beachhead, viewed the initial Allied presence as a temporary aberration. They saw the roads of Normandy as their own, secure for their movements, until the relentless, ever-growing stream of Allied trucks began to choke them. Normandy, late June 1944. The initial shock of the landings had receded, replaced by the grinding attrition of hedgerow fighting. German reconnaissance flights, often operating under severe Allied air superiority, began to report a disturbing pattern of movement behind enemy lines. These observations, initially dismissed as localized resupply efforts, soon accumulated into a compelling and unsettling picture. Aerial photographs, developed and analyzed at various Luftwaffe intelligence centers, showed an unbroken, almost liquid flow of vehicles on the narrow Norman roads. What had been anticipated as a trickle of supplies, vulnerable to interdiction, was instead a continuous artery of logistics. The photographic plates, often blurred by evasive maneuvers or poor weather, still revealed distinct columns of trucks, jeeps, and trailers snaking through the bocage. Ground observation posts, positioned precariously in forward areas or behind enemy lines, corroborated these aerial findings. Patrol reports and captured enemy documents, meticulously translated, spoke of a logistical effort far exceeding the German High Command's expectations. The sheer volume of traffic suggested a sustained and aggressive buildup, rather than the more cautious, piecemeal approach the Germans had projected. These reports directly challenged the pre-invasion assessments that Allied logistics would be severely hampered by the lack of deep-water ports and the expected destruction of the French rail network. German planners had predicated their defensive strategy on the assumption that Allied forces would struggle to move men and materiel inland with any speed or scale. The reality unfolding on the ground was a stark refutation of this fundamental premise. The implications were profound. If the Allies could sustain such a relentless flow of supplies, their operational tempo would remain high, allowing them to replace losses and exploit any tactical gains with fresh units and abundant ammunition. This negated the German advantage of fighting on interior lines, where theoretically they could shift forces more rapidly to meet threats. The Allied logistical machine, initially underestimated, was now revealing itself as a formidable weapon. The meticulous German intelligence apparatus, renowned for its exhaustive cataloging of enemy capabilities, found itself increasingly disoriented by the sheer material flow across the Normandy beachheads. Initial assessments, derived from pre-invasion reconnaissance and theoretical logistical models, posited finite limits to the Allied ability to offload and distribute supplies. These calculations, often based on the estimated throughput of a single port or the carrying capacity of a typical road network under combat conditions, projected a bottleneck that simply did not materialize. Analysts within OB West and Army Group B headquarters frequently consulted aerial photographic intelligence, which, despite its limitations in discerning individual vehicle types, clearly indicated a relentless, unbroken chain of movement. Daily reports, collated from Luftwaffe observation flights and forward reconnaissance patrols, consistently noted the continuous procession of Allied vehicles along routes previously deemed impassable or easily interdicted. The sheer volume defied established German logistical doctrine, which emphasized concentration and sequential deployment. German engineering estimates, for instance, had determined that a typical unimproved Norman road could sustain approximately 300 vehicles per day without significant deterioration, a figure derived from observed wear patterns on their own logistical arteries. Allied traffic, however, routinely exceeded this by a factor of 3 or 4, with some critical routes reportedly handling over 1,500 vehicles in a single 24-hour period, according to captured Allied traffic logs, later reviewed by German staff. This sustained intensity, far beyond what was considered sustainable, indicated an entirely different approach to road maintenance and vehicle allocation. The strategic implication of this unceasing flow was profound. German defensive planning had inherently relied on the assumption of a logistical constraint on Allied operations, believing that the enemy would eventually outrun its supply lines or be forced to consolidate assets at vulnerable choke points. This expectation underpinned many counterattack strategies, which aimed to sever these perceived arteries. Yet the Allied ability to distribute men and materiel across a broad front, seemingly without interruption, negated these tactical premises, allowing for a sustained offensive tempo that the Wehrmacht could not match. Interrogation reports from captured Allied drivers and quartermasters, though often fragmentary, consistently painted a picture of an almost industrial-scale logistical effort. They spoke of dedicated road maintenance crews working around the clock, of specialized bridging units that could span craters in hours, and of a vast, decentralized supply system that minimized reliance on single points of failure. The German High Command, accustomed to a more centralized and vulnerable supply chain, struggled to fully comprehend the resilience and redundancy built into the Allied logistical framework. This sustained, relentless movement of Allied trucks, an almost organic extension of the invasion itself, began to erode the very foundation of German defensive confidence. The roads, once thought to be natural allies in slowing the invasion, had become conduits for an unstoppable tide. The sheer, unceasing flow of materiel, defying all theoretical limitations, presented an insoluble problem for the German command. The early June reports from German forward observers had consistently noted the Allied reliance on existing road networks, a vulnerability they believed was compounded by the limited number of major arteries leading inland from the invasion beaches. These assessments, filtered through various headquarters, reinforced a long-held strategic assumption that the logistical tail of any large-scale amphibious operation would be inherently fragile, easily disrupted by interdiction and the sheer inadequacy of the local infrastructure. The Norman road system, characterized by its narrow, winding lanes and numerous small bridges, was considered by German engineers to be ill-suited for the sustained movement of heavy military traffic. Yet as July bled into August, a different reality began to manifest itself on the ground. Allied engineers, often working under direct artillery fire, were systematically upgrading and expanding the very network that had been dismissed as insufficient. Unit diaries from the 1st Engineer Special Brigade, for instance, recorded the daily progress of road-widening operations, often utilizing local materials and captured German equipment. The pace of these improvements was relentless, driven by the immediate demands of the advancing front and the ever-increasing volume of supplies. Damage reports from German aerial reconnaissance, though often delayed and incomplete, began to document the unexpected appearance of new bypasses and reinforced bridges. A reconnaissance flight over the Caen-Falaise sector in late July identified at least 3 new Class 40 bridges spanning previously impassable streams, each capable of supporting the heaviest Allied tanks. This rapid construction effort contrasted sharply with German pre-invasion intelligence, which had projected a much slower, more deliberate pace of infrastructure development. The sheer scale of the Allied engineering effort became increasingly apparent through prisoner interrogations. Captured American engineers spoke of specialized bridging units capable of erecting a 100-foot Bailey Bridge in under 6 hours, a feat that astonished their German counterparts. Production logs from British factories confirmed a massive output of prefabricated bridging sections, with over 200,000 linear feet of Bailey Bridge components shipped to Normandy by the end of July. This industrial capacity directly translated into an unprecedented ability to repair and enhance the road network. The German High Command had underestimated not only the Allied capacity for rapid engineering, but also the strategic priority placed on logistics. While German doctrine often emphasized offensive maneuver with a reliance on existing infrastructure, Allied planning had integrated robust logistical support as a fundamental component of combat power. This philosophical divergence meant that German defensive plans, predicated on disrupting a fragile supply line, were increasingly rendered ineffective by the sheer resilience of the Allied logistical system. The continuous flow of Allied trucks, often moving in tightly controlled convoys, transformed the Norman countryside into a vast, interconnected supply artery. The initial assessment of secure roads, based on pre-invasion static analysis, had failed to account for the dynamic and adaptive nature of Allied engineering. The roads, once deemed a choke point, became conduits for an inexhaustible stream of men and materiel. The German counter-offensives, intended to repel the Allied beachheads and push them back into the sea, found themselves increasingly entangled in a logistical quagmire of their own making, exacerbated by the sheer scale of the Allied advance. While German High Command had initially dismissed the sustainability of the invasion, the relentless flow of Allied materiel began to erode their confidence, transforming tactical engagements into battles of attrition they could not win. The very roads they had once considered secure arteries for their own movements now became choke points of Allied dominance. Intelligence reports from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, in early July detailed a disturbing pattern of Allied supply efficiency, noting the continuous stream of trucks moving inland from the landing zones. These reports, often dismissed as exaggerated by commanders far from the front, consistently underestimated the Allied capacity for throughput. A typical German division, operating at full strength, required approximately 400 tons of supplies per day, a figure that strained their already compromised rail and road networks. In contrast, Allied logistical planning, honed by campaigns in North Africa and Italy, anticipated far greater demands. The American First Army alone, by the end of June, was moving an average of 12,000 tons of supplies daily, primarily by truck. This colossal tonnage dwarfed German capabilities, which were further hampered by fuel shortages and relentless air interdiction. The Luftwaffe was virtually absent from the skies above Normandy, allowing Allied transport columns to operate with relative impunity during daylight hours. The German response to this logistical disparity was often piecemeal and reactive. Attempts to interdict Allied supply lines through localized ambushes or artillery bombardments met with limited success. Allied convoy discipline, combined with overwhelming air cover, rendered most such efforts futile. A single American truck company, for instance, could move more tonnage in a day than an entire German railhead could process in a week under constant threat of air attack. The strategic implications of this logistical imbalance were profound. German armored divisions, intended for swift counterattacks, frequently found themselves stalled due to lack of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. Unit diaries from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, in late July recount multiple instances of vehicles being abandoned due to empty fuel tanks, even as critical battles raged nearby. The famed German efficiency in maneuver warfare was being systematically choked by a lack of basic resources. The Allied Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system, exemplified this logistical triumph. Operational by late August, it employed thousands of trucks and drivers, moving an average of 12,500 tons of supplies per day, over 300 miles from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front lines. This continuous conveyor belt of materiel, often running 24 hours a day, sustained the rapid breakout from the Falaise pocket and the subsequent advance across France. German generals, accustomed to campaigns where their own logistics were superior, or at least competitive, found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Their own supply lines were fractured by Allied air power and partisan activity, while the enemy's seemed inexhaustible. The sheer volume of Allied trucks, a constant presence on every usable road, became a tangible symbol of their overwhelming industrial and logistical might, a relentless tide that simply never ceased. The relentless Allied logistical momentum, once unleashed, became an irresistible force against the German defensive posture in Normandy. German command reports from late July 1944, particularly those from Army Group B, consistently underestimated the sheer volume of material and personnel being funneled through the beachheads and burgeoning port facilities. Their initial assessments, based on pre-invasion intelligence, had posited a finite capacity for Allied offloading, a capacity that was swiftly and decisively exceeded by innovative engineering and an almost industrial scale of effort. Damage assessments filed by the Luftwaffe on August 3, 1944, after a series of reconnaissance flights over the American sector, noted an exponential growth in road traffic. These reports, often dismissed by higher echelons as exaggerated due to the Luftwaffe's own dwindling operational capabilities, detailed an unbroken stream of vehicles moving inland. The perceived security of the Norman road network, a cornerstone of German defensive planning, dissolved under the weight of thousands of Allied trucks, their numbers multiplying daily. The Panzer-Lehr Division, positioned to counter thrusts from the American sector, found its mobility increasingly hampered, not by direct enemy action, but by the sheer density of Allied logistical throughput. Intercepted radio traffic and prisoner interrogations from early August revealed a startling picture of Allied supply lines often operating under minimal escort, stretching for dozens of kilometers without interruption. This continuous flow rendered localized German counterattacks against supply convoys largely ineffectual, as any losses were immediately replaced by the seemingly endless reserve. German quartermaster reports from the first 2 weeks of August painted a stark contrast to the Allied abundance. Fuel allocations for armored divisions were often halved, ammunition resupply became erratic, and replacement parts for critical equipment were almost non-existent. This internal evidence of German logistical collapse stood in stark relief against the external perception of an Allied war machine that never paused, never ran dry. The strategic implication of this logistical disparity was profound. While German units were forced to conserve, ration, and improvise, Allied forces enjoyed a sustained offensive capability, able to absorb losses and maintain pressure across multiple fronts. The initial German confidence in their ability to contain the beachhead, predicated on the assumption of a finite Allied logistical tail, evaporated as the roads of Normandy became arteries of an inexhaustible invasion. The continuous rumble of Allied trucks, a sound that became synonymous with the occupation of the Norman countryside, signaled an irreversible shift in the balance of power. The post-war analysis of the Normandy campaign, compiled from captured German records and Allied operational reports, consistently highlighted the unforeseen logistical resilience of the invasion forces. German General Staff assessments, particularly those from Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's headquarters, initially dismissed the long-term viability of an Allied deep penetration from the beachheads due to perceived infrastructure limitations. These early intelligence estimates, based on pre-invasion reconnaissance and theoretical assessments of port capacity, projected a critical bottleneck for supplies within 3 weeks of a successful landing. Interrogation files from captured German officers, including General Erich Marx of XXA4 Corps, frequently referenced the unexpected volume of Allied traffic on Norman roads. Their pre-invasion planning had assumed a far more constrained supply line, anticipating that the destruction of French railway networks and the limited capacity of Cherbourg would severely restrict the flow of materiel. The reality, however, was a continuous, almost relentless stream of trucks moving inland, visible even from distant observation posts. The technical examination of Allied logistical operations revealed a multifaceted approach that bypassed many of the anticipated choke points. The development of artificial harbors, Mulberry A and B, provided an immediate and substantial offloading capability, exceeding German intelligence projections from beachhead supply. While Mulberry A was lost in the Great Storm of June 19, 1944, Mulberry B at Arromanches, despite damage, continued to discharge an average of 6,000 tons of supplies daily through July. Beyond the artificial ports, the systematic repair and expansion of existing French road networks, coupled with the construction of entirely new routes, proved critical. Engineer unit reports detail the rapid bridging of rivers and the repair of cratered roads, often under fire, ensuring continuous flow. The sheer number of engineer battalions deployed, totaling over 100,000 personnel by late June, far outstripped German expectations for such operations. The quantitative impact of this logistical effort became starkly evident in the daily tonnage figures. By the end of July 1944, Allied forces were moving an average of 20,000 tons of supplies per day from the beachheads and Cherbourg, a figure that dwarfed the German Wehrmacht's own logistical capabilities in the region. This sustained throughput directly enabled the rapid buildup of forces and the continuous offensive operations that characterized the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows. Strategic implications of this logistical superiority were profound. German defensive planning, predicated on localized counterattacks and a gradual attrition of Allied strength, was undermined by the continuous reinforcement and resupply of the invasion forces. The German High Command's repeated directives for holding ground, often against overwhelming odds, failed to account for the inexhaustible nature of the Allied supply chain. The ideological underpinnings of German military thought, often emphasizing tactical brilliance and superior fighting spirit, struggled to reconcile with the brute force of Allied industrial output and logistical efficiency. The belief that a numerically superior but logistically vulnerable enemy could be contained and eventually defeated on European soil proved to be a fundamental miscalculation. The sheer scale of the Allied effort, particularly in the seemingly mundane realm of transport, exposed a critical blind spot in German strategic assessment. The quiet reflection on these findings, decades later, often returns to the image of those relentless truck convoys. The Red Ball Express, a dedicated transport system, began operations on August 25, 1944, and by its peak in November, was moving approximately 12,500 tons of supplies daily, employing 5,958 vehicles and 49,000 personnel.